30 days, Adrian Wolfe said, his voice low and cold beneath the soft echo of the marble hall. That's how long this marriage lasts, and not a minute more. The room was filled with people who smiled too carefully and watched too closely, the kind of crowd that measured everything, status, power, weakness, like it was currency, and at the center of it all stood Emma Collins, wrapped in a white dress that wasn't hers, holding a ring that felt heavier than gold, heavier than the life she had just agreed to step into. Because this wasn't a wedding, not really. It was a transaction dressed up in silk and soft lighting, and she could feel it in the way. Adrian didn't look at her, not once. Not even as he slid the ring onto her finger with a precision that felt more like signing a contract than making a promise, his touch brief, distant, like she was something temporary, something he had already decided to forget. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow across the room, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished shoes, but none of it reached her. None of it softened the chill in the space between them, and when the officiant said the words that made it official, binding, real, Emma felt something inside her go still, not broken, not yet, just bracing. Adrian stepped back immediately, adjusting his cufflinks as if he had just completed a business meeting, not a marriage, and when their eyes finally met for the first time, there was no curiosity there, no warmth, just a quiet, unmistakable dismissal, like he had already decided who she was without needing to ask. She had seen that look before, in landlords who didn't believe her, in employers who assumed she wouldn't last, in strangers who thought they understood her story from a single glance. But this was different. This was sharper, because now she was tied to it, legally, publicly, in a way she couldn't walk away from, not for 30 days. Somewhere in the room, someone started clapping, slow and polite, and the sound spread, filling the silence that neither of them had bothered to break, and Emma forced a small smile. The kind you wear when you don't belong but need to pretend you do, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her bouquet as she reminded herself why she was here. Why she had said yes to a man who looked at her like she was a problem he intended to solve and then discard, because back in a hospital room miles away, her mother was waiting for a surgery they couldn't afford, and this ring, this contract, this cold, calculated arrangement, was the only way to buy her more time. Adrian leaned in just enough for his voice to reach her and no one else, his words quiet but cutting clean through the noise. "Don't mistake this for anything more than what it is," he said, straightening before she could respond, already turning away as if the conversation, and the marriage, required nothing further from him. And in that moment, standing beneath the lights with a stranger who was now her husband, Emma realized something that made her chest tighten just a little more than she expected. She hadn't just married a man who didn't love her. She had married a man who was certain he never would. The drive from the ceremony to Adrian Wolfe's estate took exactly 23 minutes. But to Emma it felt longer, stretched thin by silence that pressed in from every side. The kind of silence that made you aware of every small movement, every breath, every unspoken rule she had just stepped into. And Adrian did not speak once. Not to ask if she was comfortable, not to explain what came next. His attention fixed on the city slipping past the tinted windows, as if she were not sitting just inches away, as if this entire arrangement had already been filed away in his mind under something temporary, something unimportant. The gates opened before them without a sound, revealing a property that did not look like a home so much as a statement. Wide stone pathways, trimmed hedges cut with mathematical precision, windows glowing with a soft, distant light that felt more like a hotel than a place anyone actually lived. And when the car came to a stop, a man in a tailored suit opened Emma's door before she could reach for the handle herself, offering a polite nod that carried none of the curiosity she expected, as if he had already been briefed, already told exactly who she was and exactly how long she would be staying. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something expensive she could not quite name. Floors smooth and spotless beneath her shoes, every detail arranged so carefully it felt untouched, like stepping into a photograph rather than a life. And Emma paused just slightly in the entryway, taking it in, not because she was impressed, but because she was trying to understand where she was supposed to fit inside something that had clearly never been designed for her. "Your room is upstairs," Adrian said finally, his voice cutting clean through the quiet as he handed her a thin folder without looking at her. Everything you need is in there: schedule, expectations, staff contacts. And the word expectations lingered just long enough to feel like a warning rather than guidance. She took the folder, her fingers brushing against the smooth edge of the paper, noticing how neatly everything had been organized, typed, structured, as if even this marriage had been reduced to bullet points and timelines. And for a moment she almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what she should have expected from a man who had looked at their wedding like a completed task. "And the rules?" she asked quietly, her voice steady even though her chest felt tight, and Adrian finally turned his head just enough to meet her eyes, his expression unreadable, controlled. "Simple," he said. "You do not interfere with my work. You do not speak to the press, and you do not mistake this arrangement for anything personal." And there it was again, that clear line he kept drawing between them, sharp and deliberate, like he needed to remind both of them exactly where this ended before it even began. Emma nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood, and as she followed the staircase upward, each step echoing softly in the vast, quiet house, she felt the weight of the next 30 days settle over her, not as fear, but as something steadier, something more grounded, because she had not come here to belong. She had come here to endure, to do what she needed to do and leave without losing herself in the process. And behind her, Adrian remained standing in the foyer, watching her just long enough to confirm something to himself before turning away, already moving on, already treating her like a temporary detail in a life that had no intention of changing for anyone, especially not her. Emma did not open the folder until she was alone, the door to her room closing behind her with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in a space that large. And for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the room that had been assigned to her, not chosen, not offered, just designated, a bed too perfectly made, windows stretching nearly 10 feet high, curtains pulled back to reveal a view of the city lights far in the distance, beautiful in a way that felt distant rather than comforting, and everything about it told the same story the rest of the house had already made clear. This place was built for order, for control, for someone who did not leave room for unpredictability, for someone like Adrian. She set the folder down on the edge of the bed, her fingers lingering on it for a second before she finally opened it, flipping through pages that outlined her next 30 days with the precision of a business plan, schedules for public appearances, notes on expected behavior, even a section labeled wardrobe coordination, as if her existence here needed to be managed down to the smallest detail, and she let out a slow breath. Not surprised, just confirming what she already knew. This was not a marriage, it was a role, and she had been cast without rehearsal. A soft knock at the door pulled her attention away, and when she opened it, a woman in her early 50s stood there, dressed neatly, her expression calm but not cold, a tray balanced carefully in her hands. "I thought you might not have eaten," the woman said gently, stepping inside only after Emma nodded, placing the tray on a small table near the window. And there was something different in her tone, something that did not feel rehearsed or distant, something human. "Thank you," Emma replied, her voice quieter now, and the woman offered a small smile. "My name is Margaret," she added. "I manage the house." And for the first time since arriving, Emma felt something shift, just slightly, because Margaret looked at her like she was a person, not a temporary arrangement, not a problem to be managed. After Margaret left, Emma sat down slowly, staring at the food in front of her, realizing she had not eaten since early that morning, but her appetite was not what held her still. It was the weight of everything pressing in at once, the contract, the rules, the quiet understanding that she was alone in a place that did not expect her to belong. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the uncertainty, the exhaustion, the fear she had been holding back since the moment she said yes. Then her phone buzzed softly on the table, and she reached for it immediately, her breath catching just a little as she saw the hospital name on the screen. And when she answered, the nurse's voice was steady, reassuring, explaining that her mother's procedure had been scheduled, that everything was moving forward, that the deposit had gone through without issue, and Emma closed her eyes, relief washing over her in a quiet wave that steadied something deep inside her chest, because this was why she was here, not for the house, not for the man downstairs who barely acknowledged her existence, but for that one outcome, that one chance to give her mother more time. When the call ended, Emma sat there for a moment longer, then reached for the folder again, flipping back to the first page, her expression different now, more focused, more certain, because whatever this place expected from her, whatever Adrian believed she was, she would play her part, she would follow the rules, she would endure every cold glance and every silent dismissal, not because she accepted it, but because she had something far more important at stake, and somewhere downstairs. Adrian Wolfe moved through his perfectly controlled world, unaware that the woman he had just brought into his life was not there to change it. Not yet, but she was far stronger than he had assumed, and far less temporary than he intended. The next morning arrived without ceremony, no gentle transition, no easing into a new life. Just a quiet knock at exactly 7 o'clock followed by Margaret's calm voice announcing breakfast was ready, and Emma opened her eyes to a room that still did not feel like hers. The high ceiling, the filtered sunlight spilling across polished floors, everything unchanged, everything reminding her that this was temporary no matter how real it looked. And as she dressed carefully in one of the outfits that had already been placed in her closet, she noticed how everything fit perfectly, tailored without asking, chosen without her input, another quiet sign that her presence here had been anticipated, controlled, arranged long before she ever walked through the door. Downstairs, the dining room was already set, a long table that could easily seat 12 reduced to 2 places at opposite ends, and Adrian sat at his usual position, a tablet in one hand, coffee untouched beside him, his posture straight, composed, as if he had been there for hours already, and when Emma entered, he did not look up immediately, finishing whatever he was reading before setting the tablet aside with deliberate calm. "You are late," he said simply, his tone not raised, not harsh, but precise in a way that made it clear it was not a suggestion. Emma glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:03, and for a brief second she considered explaining, then decided against it, taking her seat quietly instead, because she understood now that this was not about time, it was about control. "It will not happen again," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze just long enough to show she had heard him, but not long enough to invite anything further. And for a moment something flickered in Adrian's expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, like he had expected resistance or apology and received neither. Breakfast was served in silence, the kind that was not uncomfortable for him but required effort from her. Each movement measured, each sound amplified in the stillness, and Emma focused on the small things, the warmth of the coffee, the steady rhythm of her breathing, grounding herself in something real rather than the distance sitting across from her. "You have an event tonight," Adrian said after a few minutes, sliding a single page across the table toward her. "Charity gala, 8 p.m., you will stay by my side, speak only when necessary, and follow my lead." His words structured, efficient, like instructions rather than conversation. Emma picked up the page, scanning it quickly, noting the location, the expected guests, the dress code already outlined, and she nodded once, setting it down with care. "Understood," she said, her voice calm. And again there was that brief pause, that almost invisible hesitation from Adrian, as if her composure did not align with whatever version of her he had already decided on. After breakfast, Emma wandered briefly through the house, not exploring, just observing, learning the rhythm of the space, the quiet coordination of staff, the way everything moved without disruption, and she noticed the small things others might overlook, the way one of the younger staff members struggled slightly with a heavy tray, the way Margaret adjusted something before anyone could notice it was out of place, and without thinking too much about it. Emma stepped forward at one point, steadying the tray with a simple, "I have it," her tone gentle, natural, and the young man looked surprised for a second before nodding gratefully, the moment small, almost insignificant, but real in a way the rest of the house was not. From the hallway, Adrian saw it, not the action itself, but the ease of it, the absence of hesitation or performance, and he stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching quietly before turning away, telling himself it meant nothing, that it was exactly what someone in her position would do to appear agreeable, to fit in, to secure her place for the duration of their agreement, and yet, despite that explanation, something about it did not sit neatly within the controlled structure he relied on, Something about her did not follow the script he had already written in his mind. And as the day moved forward toward the evening that would place them under the scrutiny of the public eye, Adrian found himself noticing her more than he intended, not because he was interested, but because she was not behaving the way he expected, and that, more than anything else, was something he did not like. By the time evening arrived, the house had shifted into something quieter but more deliberate, the kind of stillness that came before being seen, and Emma stood in front of the mirror in her room, the dress chosen for her already laid out hours before, a deep navy gown that fit her like it had been measured to the inch, simple but elegant, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention for the wrong reasons. And as she adjusted the fabric at her waist, she caught her own reflection and paused, not because she did not recognize herself, but because she did, and that surprised her more than anything, because despite everything, despite the contract and the rules and the man waiting downstairs who had made it clear she meant nothing beyond an obligation, she still looked like herself, steady, composed, someone who had not been erased by the circumstances she had stepped into. When she descended the staircase, Adrian was already waiting near the entrance, dressed in a tailored black suit that matched the quiet authority he carried without effort, and for a brief second his eyes lifted to her, taking in the way she carried herself, the way she moved without hesitation, and though his expression did not change, there was a slight pause before he spoke, as if recalibrating something internally. "We leave in 2 minutes," he said, checking his watch, his tone as controlled as ever, and Emma gave a small nod, stepping into place beside him without asking questions, without seeking reassurance, and that alone made something shift again, subtle but present. The car ride to the gala was shorter this time, or perhaps it only felt that way because Emma had stopped expecting conversation, her focus instead on what awaited them, the instructions he had given, the unspoken expectations layered beneath them, and when they arrived, the building rose ahead of them in glass and light, photographers already gathered near the entrance, their cameras ready, their attention sharp, and as the car door opened, Emma felt the world outside shift instantly, louder, brighter, more demanding. Adrian stepped out first, every movement precise, then turned slightly, offering his hand, not as a gesture of warmth, but as part of the image they were expected to present, and Emma accepted it without hesitation, her fingers resting lightly against his as they stepped forward together, the flashes beginning immediately, voices calling his name, questions thrown into the air, and she stayed exactly where she needed to be, not behind him, not ahead, but beside him, just as instructed. Inside, the room was filled with the low hum of conversation and the soft clink of glass against glass. People dressed in carefully curated elegance, every glance calculated, every smile practiced, and Emma could feel the shift in attention as they entered, not all at once, but in waves, curiosity first, then recognition, then quiet judgment, and she held her posture steady, her expression calm, because she understood what they saw when they looked at her, a stranger, an unknown variable, standing next to a man who controlled rooms without effort. "Stay close," Adrian murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and she gave the smallest nod, already doing exactly that, her awareness sharp but controlled, and as they moved through the crowd, she observed more than she spoke, the subtle dynamics, the way people approached Adrian with carefully chosen words, the way conversations shifted the moment he responded, and at one point, when a server passing by nearly lost balance under the weight of a tray, Emma instinctively reached out, steadying it with a quick, quiet motion that went unnoticed by most, but not by Adrian, who saw it from the corner of his eye, that same effortless kindness, uncalculated, unannounced, and for a brief moment, something in his expression tightened, not in disapproval, but in something closer to uncertainty, because once again, she was not behaving the way he had expected, and that, more than anything else, was beginning to disrupt the certainty he relied on. The evening moved forward in a steady rhythm of introductions and measured conversations, each interaction blending into the next with a polished ease that Emma quickly learned to navigate, listening more than speaking, observing the subtle cues that guided every exchange, and Adrian remained at the center of it all, composed and controlled, his presence commanding attention without effort. Yet despite the crowd, despite the constant movement around them, There was a growing awareness between them, quiet but undeniable, shaped not by what was said but by what was noticed. Adrian, a voice called smoothly from behind, and he turned slightly as a man in his mid-40s approached, his smile practiced, his handshake firm, the kind of confidence that came from power rather than personality, and Emma felt the shift immediately, the tone changing, sharper, more calculated. "I was beginning to think you would not show," the man said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Emma before returning to Adrian. And though his expression remained polite, there was something underneath it, something assessing. "I am here," Adrian replied evenly, his tone neutral, and the two men exchanged a few more words, the conversation moving quickly into business, figures, timelines, decisions that carried weight far beyond the room they stood in, and Emma stayed beside him, exactly where she was supposed to be, her posture steady, her presence quiet but attentive. "And this must be your wife," the man added after a moment, finally addressing her directly, his smile widening just slightly, but not quite reaching his eyes, and Emma met his gaze calmly, offering a small nod. "Emma," she said simply, her voice clear, not overly polite, not distant, just present, and for a brief second, the man seemed almost surprised, as if he had expected something else, something less certain. "Interesting," he replied, his tone light but layered, before turning back to Adrian, continuing the conversation as if she were no longer part of it. And Emma felt it, that familiar dismissal, but this time it did not settle the way it once might have, because she understood now that this world operated on perception, on assumptions, and she had no intention of confirming either. As the conversation shifted again, a server approached with a tray of drinks, pausing just slightly as the space around them tightened, and Emma noticed it immediately, the hesitation, the uncertainty of where to step, and without drawing attention, she adjusted her position just enough to create space, offering a quiet, "You are fine," that allowed the server to move forward without disruption, the moment small, almost invisible, but it changed the flow, smoothed something that could have easily turned awkward, and Adrian saw it again. Not just the action but the instinct behind it, the awareness, the way she moved through a space she had never been part of as if she understood it better than expected. Later, as the conversation ended and the man walked away, Adrian glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "You do not speak much," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, and Emma met his gaze for a second before looking back at the room. "I speak when it matters," she replied, her tone calm, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no need to prove anything beyond that. And for the first time that evening, Adrian did not respond immediately, his attention lingering just a fraction longer than usual, as if weighing her words against the assumptions he had already made, as if trying to place her within a framework that no longer quite fit. Around them, the gala continued, conversations rising and falling, laughter echoing softly under the lights. But something had shifted, subtle but real, not enough to change the rules between them, not yet, but enough to create a crack in the certainty Adrian had carried from the beginning, because the woman standing beside him was not playing a role the way he expected, she was simply being herself, and that was something far more difficult to control. The music shifted subtly as the evening moved deeper into its rhythm, softer now, more intimate, and the crowd adjusted with it, conversations loosening, laughter becoming less measured, and for the first time since they arrived, Emma felt the tension ease just slightly, not because the room had changed, but because she had, her steps more certain, her awareness sharper, her place beside Adrian no longer feeling like something she had to constantly calculate. "We will stay another 30 minutes, Adrian said quietly as they paused near one of the tall windows overlooking the city, his voice steady, as if the timing of their departure had been decided long before they even arrived, and Emma nodded once, her gaze briefly drifting beyond the glass to the lights stretching out below, a reminder that there was an entire world beyond this room, beyond the expectations pressing in from every direction. "Do you always plan everything this precisely?" she asked after a moment, her tone calm, not challenging, just curious, and Adrian glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled again. "It prevents unnecessary complications," he replied, and there it was again, that word choice, complications, as if anything unplanned, anything emotional, anything human fell into that category, something to be avoided rather than understood. Emma considered that for a second, then gave a small nod, not agreeing, but acknowledging, because she was beginning to see the structure he lived within, the boundaries he had built so carefully around himself, and she wondered briefly what had made him that way, what had taught him that control was safer than connection, but she did not ask, because she knew this was not a space where questions like that were welcomed. Before she could say anything else, a woman approached, her presence drawing subtle attention as she moved, confident, composed, the kind of person who knew exactly how she was perceived and used it to her advantage. "Adrian," she said with a familiar ease, her smile warm but precise, and Emma felt the shift immediately, not in the room, but in him, the slightest tightening of his posture, the smallest delay before he responded. "Vanessa," he acknowledged, his tone controlled, but different, and the woman's gaze moved to Emma, assessing, curious, and something else that was harder to define. "So this is the wife," Vanessa said, her voice light, but carrying just enough weight to make the words linger, and Emma met her gaze steadily, offering the same calm presence she had carried all evening. "Emma," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to impress, just the simple truth of who she was. And Vanessa studied her for a second longer than expected, as if searching for something that did not immediately present itself. "You are not what I expected," Vanessa said finally, her tone almost thoughtful, and Emma allowed a small, polite smile. "I hear that a lot," she answered, and for a brief second, something shifted in the air between them, subtle, but real, because this was not the response Vanessa had anticipated, not the insecurity, not the need to prove anything, just quiet confidence, and Adrian noticed it too. The way Emma held herself, the way she did not shrink under scrutiny, did not adjust herself to fit expectations, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As Vanessa turned her attention back to Adrian, continuing a conversation that clearly carried history, Emma stepped slightly aside, not withdrawing, but allowing space, her awareness still present, her attention still engaged, and she watched, not the words, but the dynamics, the familiarity, the unspoken tension beneath the surface, and for the first time that evening, she realized something important, something that shifted her understanding of the man she had married, because Adrian Wolfe, for all his control, for all his precision, was not unaffected. He was simply very good at hiding it, and that realization stayed with her as the minutes passed, as the conversation unfolded, as the night slowly moved toward its end, because it was the first real indication that beneath everything he had shown her so far, there was more, something unspoken, something unresolved, and whether she wanted to or not, she was now close enough to see it. By the time they left the gala, the city had grown quieter, the bright energy of the evening fading into something softer, more distant, and the car ride back carried a different kind of silence than before, not as rigid, not as sharp, but still filled with things neither of them chose to say, and Emma sat with her hands folded lightly in her lap, her mind replaying pieces of the night, the conversations, the looks, the way Vanessa's presence had shifted something in Adrian that he had tried to conceal, but not quite successfully, and she wondered, not out of curiosity alone but out of growing awareness, how much of him was built on control and how much was simply hiding behind it. Adrian, seated beside her, kept his gaze forward, his posture unchanged, but his thoughts were not as steady as they appeared, because for the first time in a long time, something had slipped past his expectations, something he had not accounted for, and it was not the gala, not the business discussions, not even Vanessa, it was Emma, the way she had moved through the evening without forcing herself into it, without trying to impress or retreat, simply existing in a way that did not align with the assumptions he had made about her from the start, and that inconsistency unsettled him more than any direct challenge would have. When they arrived back at the house, the lights were dimmed, the space returning to its usual quiet order, and Emma stepped out of the car first this time, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she had already adjusted to the rhythm of the place, and Adrian followed a second later, watching her briefly before turning toward the entrance, the distance between them still present, but no longer as absolute as it had been before. Inside, Margaret greeted them with a polite nod, her eyes moving between them for just a moment longer than necessary, as if noticing something unspoken, something different, and Emma offered her a small smile before heading toward the staircase, her body tired but her mind still alert, still processing, still adapting. Emma, Adrian's voice stopped her halfway up the stairs, and she turned slightly, her hand resting on the railing, waiting, not tense, not uncertain, just present, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking, something that rarely happened. "You handled tonight adequately," he said, the word chosen carefully, as if anything more would break a line he was not ready to cross, and Emma held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "So did you," she replied, her tone even, and for the briefest second, there was something. Almost like a reaction in his expression, not irritation, not approval, something in between, something unfamiliar, and then it was gone, replaced by the control he defaulted to. She turned and continued up the stairs without waiting for anything more, leaving him standing there in the quiet space, and Adrian remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his thoughts shifting in ways he did not fully like, because the simplicity of the arrangement he had created was beginning to complicate itself, not through conflict, not through defiance, but through something far more difficult to manage: unpredictability. Later that night, as Emma sat by the window in her room, the city lights stretching out below her, she opened the folder again, not to study the schedule, but to remind herself of the boundaries, the structure, the temporary nature of everything around her. And yet, as she closed it, she realized something had already begun to change, not in the contract, not in the rules, but in the space between them, subtle, quiet, but real, because for the first time since this arrangement began, Adrian Wolf had paused before speaking, and that pause meant something, even if neither of them was ready to name it yet. The next morning did not ease into anything softer. It sharpened, because while the house remained as quiet and controlled as ever, something beneath the surface had begun to shift, and Adrian felt it before he understood it. Sitting in his office with floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city that moved on his terms, reviewing reports that normally held his full attention but now seemed to blur at the edges, because his mind kept circling back to details he would have once dismissed, the way Emma had answered Vanessa without hesitation, the way she had moved through the gala without seeking approval, the way she had not once tried to use his name to elevate herself, and none of it aligned with the narrative he had already constructed about her. And that inconsistency demanded resolution. By mid-morning, he had already made a decision, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because Adrian Wolf did not tolerate unknown variables, and Emma Collins had become exactly that, an unknown he could not categorize, could not predict, and that alone was enough to justify action. "I want a full background report," he said, into his phone, his tone even, controlled, as if he were discussing any other business matter. Everything. And the person on the other end did not ask questions, because they never did. And when the call ended, Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the city again, not because he was distracted, but because he was calculating, preparing, restoring the sense of control he relied on. Upstairs, unaware of the decision that had just been made, Emma moved through the morning with a quiet focus that had already begun to define her presence in the house, not inserting herself, not overstepping, but not shrinking either, and Margaret watched her with a kind of quiet approval, noticing the way she greeted the staff by name, the way she adjusted small things without being asked, not to impress, but because it was natural to her, and that alone set her apart in a place where most people performed rather than existed. Later that afternoon, Emma sat at a small desk near the window in her room, her phone pressed gently between her shoulder and ear as she spoke softly, her voice carrying a warmth that had not been heard anywhere else in the house. "I will be there this weekend," she said, her tone reassuring, steady, and on the other end, her mother's voice, faint but hopeful, responded with quiet gratitude, the conversation simple, grounded, real in a way that nothing else in her current life was. And when the call ended, Emma remained still for a moment, her gaze resting on nothing in particular, just allowing herself to breathe, to hold on to that connection before stepping back into the role she had agreed to play. Downstairs, Adrian received the first update earlier than expected, a message sent directly to his private line, concise, structured. exactly the way he preferred, and he read it once. Then again, his expression unchanged, but something inside him tightening just slightly, because what he was seeing did not match what he had assumed, not even close. And for the first time since this arrangement began, there was a shift not just in his perception, but in his certainty, because the woman he had married for convenience was not aligning with the version he had created, and as he set his phone down slowly, his thoughts no longer moved with the same clarity they once had, because now, instead of confirming his expectations, the truth was beginning to challenge them, and Adrian Wolf was not accustomed to being wrong. The information did not come all at once. It never did. It arrived in pieces, structured, verified, precise, and Adrian read through it in silence, each line quietly dismantling the version of Emma he had constructed so confidently in his mind, because there was no trace of manipulation, no hidden accounts, no calculated connections, just a record of small jobs, late payments, hospital bills, and a pattern that did not point to ambition in the way he understood it, but to survival, steady, unremarkable, and undeniably real. And as he reached the end of the report, he did not feel satisfaction, not the kind that came with confirming a suspicion. Instead, there was something else, something heavier, something that did not fit neatly into logic. He set the tablet down slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed ahead but unfocused, because for the first time, the narrative he had relied on had been proven incomplete, and Adrian Wolf did not like incomplete. He did not accept it, and yet here it was, undeniable, unavoidable. Downstairs, Emma was unaware of any of it, moving through the afternoon with the same quiet consistency she had carried since the beginning, and Margaret approached her near the kitchen, a folded set of linens in her hands. "You do not have to help," Margaret said gently, watching as Emma adjusted a stack that had been left slightly uneven, and Emma gave a small, easy smile. "I know," she replied, "but it does not feel right to just stand by when something needs doing." And there was no performance in her tone, no attempt to be seen, just a simple truth, and Margaret nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. Later, as Emma stepped outside briefly, the late afternoon light soft against the quiet grounds, she paused near the edge of the garden, her phone in her hand again, checking the time, calculating how long until the weekend, until she could visit the hospital, until she could see for herself that everything was going the way it was supposed to. And for a moment, she allowed herself to exhale, to release the tension she carried so carefully. Just for a second, before pulling it back in, steadying herself once more. Inside, Adrian stood near the window of his office, the city stretching out beneath him. But his attention was no longer on the view. It was on the realization settling in with quiet persistence, because everything about Emma Collins contradicted the assumptions he had made, and that left him with only two possibilities. Either she was far more skilled at deception than anyone he had encountered before, or he had been wrong from the beginning, and neither option sat comfortably within the control he depended on. When Emma returned inside, their paths crossed briefly in the hallway, unplanned, unstructured, and for a moment they simply stood there, the space between them filled with something neither had fully acknowledged yet, and Adrian's gaze lingered just a fraction longer than before, not dismissive, not indifferent, but searching in a way that was new, unfamiliar even to him. "You will need to prepare for another event tomorrow," he said finally, his voice measured, but lacking the sharp edge it once carried, and Emma nodded, her expression calm. "I will be ready," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no resentment, just quiet certainty. And as she moved past him, continuing down the hallway without waiting for anything more, Adrian remained where he was for a second longer, his thoughts no longer aligned with the simplicity he had intended for this arrangement. Because somewhere between the contract and the expectations, something had begun to shift, and he was no longer entirely certain where it would lead. The next day unfolded with a tension that did not announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, beneath the surface, in the way Adrian watched more closely than before, in the way Emma moved with the same steady composure, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in how he saw her. And by the time evening approached, the second event loomed not just as another obligation, but as a test neither of them had agreed to, yet both were about to face. This time, the preparation felt different, Not because the expectations had changed, but because Adrian's perception had. And as he stood in the foyer waiting, his attention was no longer detached, no longer indifferent. It was focused, observant in a way that carried weight. And when Emma descended the stairs, dressed once again with quiet elegance, there was a brief pause, not long, not obvious, but enough to register, enough to disrupt the rhythm he was used to maintaining. "We leave now," he said, his tone controlled, but lacking the cold edge it once carried. And Emma nodded, stepping beside him with the same calm presence she had shown before, unaware that this time, he was not just assessing her role, he was reassessing everything he thought he knew. The event was smaller, more private, held in a space that felt less like a stage and more like a negotiation room disguised in soft lighting and curated decor, and as they entered, the atmosphere shifted immediately, conversations quieter, more deliberate, eyes sharper, because this was not about appearance. This was about influence, about decisions that would shape outcomes far beyond the room. Adrian moved through it with practiced ease, but his attention did not fully leave Emma, not the way it had before, and he noticed the details again, the way she listened before speaking, the way she chose her words carefully when she did, never overstepping, never diminishing herself, just existing with a balance he had not expected, and it unsettled him more now because he no longer had the certainty to dismiss it. Midway through the evening, a conversation shifted unexpectedly. A potential partner questioning a decision Adrian had made regarding a community development project, his tone skeptical, his argument sharp, and for a moment, the room leaned in slightly, waiting to see how Adrian would respond. But before he could, Emma spoke, not loudly, not interrupting, but clearly enough to be heard. "The project is not just about return," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting the man's without hesitation. "It is about stability, long-term, for people who do not usually get considered in those equations." And there was no challenge in her tone, no attempt to undermine, just a perspective, grounded, real, and the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to register, because it was not expected. And Adrian turned to her, just slightly, his expression unreadable, but his attention fully there now. The man studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, the tension easing, the conversation redirecting, and as it moved on, Adrian did not speak immediately, his thoughts recalibrating in real time, because this was not part of the script, not part of the role he had assigned her. And yet, it had worked, not through force, not through status, but through something else entirely, something he had not valued before. When the conversation ended and the moment passed, Adrian leaned slightly closer, his voice low, meant only for her. "That was not necessary," he said, but there was no reprimand in it, just something quieter, something uncertain, and Emma met his gaze briefly. "It felt right," she replied simply, and for the first time, Adrian did not have an immediate response, because for a man who built his world on control and calculation, the idea of acting because it felt right was not something he understood, and yet, standing there beside her, watching the subtle impact of her words ripple outward, he could not deny that it had changed something, not just in the room, but in him. And as the evening continued, Adrian Wolfe began to realize that the woman he had brought into his life as a temporary solution was no longer something he could categorize so easily, and that realization carried a weight he had not prepared for. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It built slowly, quietly, in the spaces between words, in the moments Adrian could no longer ignore, and by the time they returned home that night, something had already crossed a line neither of them had acknowledged yet, but both could feel, and this time, the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with something heavier, something that demanded recognition. Emma stepped inside first, slipping out of her heels near the entrance with a small breath of relief she did not bother to hide, her posture relaxing just slightly now that the expectations of the outside world had fallen away, and Adrian watched it. The shift, the difference between how she carried herself in public and how she allowed herself to exist in private, and it struck him again how little of what she did felt calculated, how much of it felt real, and that realization unsettled him in a way he could no longer dismiss. "Emma," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet before she could move further into the house, and she turned, her expression calm. open in a way that made it harder to maintain distance. And for a second, Adrian did not speak. Something holding him there, something unfamiliar pressing against the control he had relied on for so long. "Why did you say that tonight?" he asked finally, his tone not accusatory, but searching, as if he needed to understand something that no longer fit within his usual logic. And Emma considered the question, her gaze steady. "Because it was true," she replied simply, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to frame it in a way that would make sense to him. Just honesty, direct and unguarded. And Adrian felt something shift again, sharper this time, because he realized he had been expecting a different answer, something strategic, something self-serving, something he could categorize and move past. But she had given him none of that. "That is not how this works," he said, though the words carried less certainty than they once would have. And Emma tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet curiosity. "Then maybe that is the problem," she said, her voice calm, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else could have, because it was not a challenge, it was an observation. And Adrian found himself without an immediate response, something that had not happened in a very long time. The space between them held for a moment longer, charged in a way that neither of them had prepared for, and then Emma gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken, before turning and continuing up the stairs, leaving Adrian standing there once again. But this time, the stillness felt different, heavier, because now he could not ignore it. The shift, the change, the fact that the woman he had brought into his life as a controlled variable was no longer behaving in ways he could predict or manage. Later that night, Adrian stood alone in his office, the contract laid out on his desk, the same document he had once viewed as a safeguard, a structure, a guarantee that nothing within this arrangement could move beyond its defined limits. And he stared at it for a long moment, his mind replaying everything he had seen, everything he had learned, everything that no longer aligned with the certainty he had started with. And for the first time, the contract did not feel like control, it felt like a limitation, something that no longer fit the reality unfolding around him. His hand moved almost without thinking, fingers brushing against the edge of the paper, and he paused, the weight of the decision settling in, because this was not just about the arrangement anymore. It was about something far more complicated, something he had spent years avoiding. And as he stood there in the quiet, Adrian Wolf realized something that changed everything. He was no longer trying to maintain distance. He was trying to understand it. And that was the beginning of something he had not planned for, something that could not be contained within 30 days or any contract he had ever written. Morning arrived with a clarity that neither of them could ignore anymore, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty, but inevitable. And Emma stood by the window in her room with a small bag resting on the chair behind her, not packed in a rush, not filled with desperation, but prepared with quiet intention, because the weekend had come, and with it, the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to return to the hospital, to see her mother, to step briefly out of the world she had entered and back into the one that mattered most to her. And yet, as she reached for the door, there was a pause, not hesitation, but awareness, because she knew something had changed, even if it had not been spoken. Downstairs, Adrian was already awake, standing in the same place he had been the night before, the contract no longer on his desk but still present in his thoughts. And when he heard her footsteps on the stairs, he turned, not out of routine, but because he had been waiting, something he had not admitted even to himself. "You are leaving," he said, his voice steady, but no longer distant, and Emma nodded, meeting his gaze without discomfort. "For the day," she replied, her tone calm, and there was no need to explain further, because this was not something that required permission. And for the first time, Adrian did not reach for control, did not remind her of schedules or expectations. He simply stood there, the weight of everything unsaid settling between them. "I read the report," he said after a moment, the words direct, without pretense, and Emma's expression did not change, not surprised, not defensive, just still, because she had expected this, not the timing, but the inevitability of it. And Adrian took a step closer, something deliberate in the movement, something that carried more meaning than anything he had said before. "I was wrong," he continued, the words simple, but heavy, because for a man like him, they were not easy, not familiar. And Emma held his gaze, not softening, not hardening, just present. Yes, she said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, no satisfaction, just truth. And for a second, Adrian almost smiled, not out of humor, but because she had once again refused to respond the way he expected. This arrangement, he gestured slightly, not needing to specify. It was meant to be temporary, controlled, and his voice faltered just slightly, not breaking, but shifting. But it is not anymore. And that was the closest he had come to admitting what had changed, the closest he had come to stepping outside the structure he had built. Emma listened, her expression steady, and then she shook her head, just once, not rejecting him, but clarifying something he had not yet fully understood. It was always temporary, she said, her voice calm. For me. And the words landed with a quiet finality, not cruel, not cold, but real, because while he had been adjusting his perception, she had been living with a clear endpoint from the beginning, and that difference mattered. Adrian stood there, absorbing it, the realization settling in fully now, because this was the part he had not accounted for, not just that he had changed, but that she might not have changed in the same way. And for the first time, the balance between them shifted, not in power, but in certainty. Without another word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the contract, now folded, no longer pristine, and held it between them for a second before tearing it cleanly in half. The sound quiet but unmistakable, and then again, reducing it to pieces that no longer held any meaning, any authority, any control, and Emma watched, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just steady, because this was not a grand gesture to her. It was simply a choice, one that came with consequences he was only beginning to understand. I am not asking you to stay because of this, Adrian said, his voice low, honest in a way it had never been before. I am asking you to stay because I choose you. And there it was, the unthinkable not in the act itself, but in the truth behind it, because for the first time, Adrian Wolfe had chosen something without calculating the outcome, without securing control, without knowing what would happen next, and Emma stood there, the pieces of the contract between them, the space no longer defined by rules or expectations, but by something far more uncertain and far more real. And as she looked at him, truly looked, she realized that whatever happened next would not be decided by a contract or a timeline or a plan, but by something neither of them had intended to find. And that was where their story truly began. Step into one of the most emotional millionaire stories where a powerful CEO enters a cold, contract marriage with a struggling young woman, believing she is nothing more than a temporary solution. But everything begins to change as her quiet strength, integrity, and unexpected kindness slowly disrupt his controlled world. In this deeply moving narrative among the best millionaire stories, the CEO's calculated life is challenged by a woman who never tries to impress, never asks for more, and never breaks her dignity even when misunderstood, while behind her calm presence lies a personal sacrifice driven by love for her family. As tension builds through high society events, subtle confrontations, and unspoken emotional shifts, this story stands out among millionaire stories for its realistic character development and powerful emotional logic, showing how assumptions can break when confronted with authenticity. The billionaire CEO, once certain that everything could be controlled by contracts and logic, begins to question his own beliefs as he uncovers the truth about the woman he married, leading to a transformation that defines the heart of great millionaire stories. When the moment of truth arrives, the CEO faces a choice that changes everything, proving that real love is not built on status or power, but on action and honesty, making this one of the most unforgettable millionaire stories where a contract turns into something real and where the line between obligation and genuine emotion disappears forever. Character 1. A 35-year-old white male millionaire CEO, sharp facial features, confident expression, wearing a tailored black suit and white dress shirt, clean hairstyle, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, high detail, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, professional cinematic style. Character 2. A 24-year-old white female struggling woman, soft natural features, expressive eyes, minimal makeup, simple elegant navy dress, slightly worn but clean, front-facing portrait, gentle lighting, realistic texture, no CGI, no illustration, No cartoon, cinematic realism style.